You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to Proof Text and Glossa House TV. I'm Michael Halcomb, and today I have the privilege of talking with Dr. Joe Rigney. I'm in the middle of reading his new book on leadership and emotional sabotage, which I want to encourage everyone to get a hold of. I'll have a link for that in the show description. But Dr. Rigney is a fellow in theology at New St. Andrews, and it's in Moscow. Do we say it Moscow or Moscow?
Moscow.
Moscow.
Moscow is Russia. Moscow is Idaho.
Okay, Moscow, Idaho. I've never been to that part of Idaho, but Idaho, to me, I was there a couple summers ago. That's an amazing state. Like,
Yeah.
the topography of Idaho is like mind blowing. It's like going to different. You can feel like you're going to multiple different countries in like a day.
That's right. Yeah, no, it's definitely, it's not what you think. Like, people sort of have an idea of it, but it's actually like mountains and piney forests, but then like big, it's like the foothills of the Cascades and the foothills of the Rockies and all kinds of stuff. So yeah, that's great. And then we're in the hills.
It's an amazing, amazing place, Idaho. So lots of good things going on at New St. Andrews, and I'm excited to dive into this book with you. In reading through like the preface and stuff, it seems like the book you said is like over a decade in the making. Tell us a little bit about where the book Leadership and Emotional Sabotage. By the way, the subtitle's really good too. Resisting the anxiety that'll wreck your family, destroy your church, and ruin the world. Where did this come from?
Yeah, so at some point, probably about when I was at Bethlehem, probably 10, 15 years ago, I was teaching a course on leadership. And I don't remember exactly how I ended up picking up Edwin Friedman's A Failure of Nerve, but I did. And was really, it was an eye-opening, illuminating, penny drop kind of books. Lots of things kind of fell into place. And I spent the next few years kind of teaching that book in leadership courses and pastoral sorts of things. And kind of as a translation project. Friedman wasn't a Christian. He's a evolutionary thinker, so a lot of his illustrations and things are heavily influenced by evolution. He was a Jewish rabbi, so he did have some kind of biblical frameworks sort of operating, I think, in the background. Sometimes in the foreground, he would make references to biblical stories. But there was always this kind of like, got to translate this. And then over time, a number of his sort of concepts began to be even more manifest kind of in the church and the culture. I just began to see it everywhere. And so that kind of ramped it up. And by the end, I had kind of developed that plus some of my own biblical reflections or other great texts that I was reading as I was teaching, so Shakespeare and different things, had kind of solidified a vision of leadership that I was really helped by personally, and that I was commending to others. And so last year, Canon asked, "Hey, would you want to kind of pull that together for us?" And I pulled it together in kind of in a course on Canon Plus. But then, and then after I did that, it was kind of like, well, I'm already kind of halfway to a book. Why don't I just fill out each chapter and we'll make it a small book. And so that's kind of where it came from, was kind of pulling together kind of these different threads of leadership from Friedman to Shakespeare, but then especially scriptures as kind of a way of anchoring and rooting those observations about how institutions work and how leaders can be steered and sabotaged within them.
Yeah, the opening page of the introduction. This is interesting. I mean, I probably have read your first page a dozen times, like in a really good way, because I'm like that. It's one of the best openings for an introduction that I've probably read in a long time. And so I want to take a little time, if you're up for, just to like exegete that. It's really like, that was a good sentence. Like that was a good paragraph. So I want to read the opening bit and Let's just talk. It says, here's how it opens. We live in an age of anxiety, confusion, and turmoil. There's something in the air that feels highly combustible, a highly reactive atmosphere that pervades all institutions of society, from families to churches to businesses to governments. There's a sense that we're sitting on a powder keg, one small match, and kaboom. In other words, we live in an age of angst and agitation marked by fierce anxiety storms that shoot through society and reactive social stampedes that trample everything in their path. I read that so many times. It's such a good opener. Um, yes, right now, I mean, go ahead. Yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
so that I'm definitely there channeling Friedman. That's kind of it was that was years of trying to distill down and in some cases dress up some of his analysis. Kind of he was writing in the '90s, um, and but trying to really capture that the feel that kind of environmental factor of you don't quite know what's going on. His term for it was anxiety, chronic anxiety, which is a little bit of a different word. We think of anxiety as something kind of inside of us.
Mm,
And he was kind of using it more in this sort of social, environmental sense. There's an anxious atmosphere.
mm,
So I think the word angst actually captures that a little bit better. And then he introduced these different categories like herding. So he used the language of herding, the herding instinct. And that just automatically made, at some point along the way, it was like social, it's a social stampede. And so that's kind of
mm,
where I took that concept from him of a herding and said, a social stampede is what we see happening
yeah.
where everybody kind of does this and then does that back and forth, and it's all led by reactions. Which then in the book, it was kind of like, what's the biblical term for that kind of reactive nature? And the Bible does have a term for it. It's passions. And so I kind of then wanted to bring that phenomenon that Friedman was really great at drawing out, but kind of bring it into more of a biblical vocabulary of when passions are in the driver's seat, when passions are leading us, when passions are or we're being conformed to our passions. So that's kind of where I took that idea later in the book. But it is like Friedman's analysis is really spot on. But the book that he wrote on it was unfinished when he died. It was kind of thrown
Mm.
together, and so there was I think, some deficiencies in it because of that. And so, but he was seeing something, and so trying to pull that together. That's where that kind of came from.
I love that. And yeah, the idea of social stampedes, like when I read or hear that, it evokes for me that the idea was it Doug, I can't remember his last name, but the madness of crowds, that
Yeah,
whole
Douglas Murray. Yeah,
yeah, Doug Murray, yeah. That whole idea, the madness of crowds, and we're it seems like we're seeing that mob mentality, madness of crowds just amp up like increasingly day by day, month by month, that kind of thing. You say right on the tail of that. And this is really good. Our world demands that whole communities adapt to their most reactive, unstable, and immature members. Whoo, talk
yeah.
about that.
Yeah, again, that's me channeling Friedman. So I want to make sure I give credit where it's due, but it was sort of recognizing the way that kind of steering and hijacking happens, where usually in the name of compassion or empathy, people begin to want to adapt to the whoever throws the biggest fit, um,
Right.
whoever threat. So in any given institution, there's someone who you walk around on eggshells around, and it's that idea that you're kind of treading lightly because you don't want to set it off. And as a result, the incentive structures shift. People realize the way to get your way around here is to be the most reactive, immature, unstable, and so you get more of it. Um, and then the flip side is that you kind of leverage pressure, put pressure, leverage on the most mature, the folks who aren't going to do that.
Hmm.
And so if they do try to take a stand, they're quickly pressured back in line. Hey, don't say that. Even though I agree with you. I know it's true. But if you say that, people are going to be hurt or people are not going to like it. And so the pressure gets. So where does the pressure get applied? Who's expected to take responsibility for themselves, who's expected to take responsibility for their actions and their words. Usually, it's the leader where all of that pressure
Right.
goes, which is what the leader's for. But the leader can get steered by it and or worn down by it over time. It just gets exhausting to kind of constantly have to thread every needle. in order to lead, as opposed and so the institution as a whole kind of drifts or gets steered, depending on the image you want to use, rather than having sort of purpose, vision, direction with a leader saying, "Here's where we're going. Everybody, yeah, you all come." Um, that doesn't happen because we're leveraging power to the most sensitive.
Why is that? Why is there a why is there a propensity to do that? I was in a meeting yesterday, a denominational meeting, and I'm hearing once again this talk about safe spaces. This needs to be a safe space for people. Why? And it's like, can't people just grow up and act like adults, like be adults about it? Like, why is there a propensity to, I don't know, coddle the
Yeah.
weakest, the most immature?
Yeah, so I think some of it is actually the fruit of Christianity's influence in society. It's a kind of corruption of a Christian impulse, which is to care for the weak. So whether
Hmm.
it's Christ leaves the 99 to go after the one lost sheep, that kind of impulse has kind of worked its way into Western civilization, or something like Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 8, where or Romans 14, those who are strong have an obligation to bear with the failings of the weak.
Hmm.
And if I don't want to cause my brother to stumble, and so I think for at least, especially for Christian, like I think that impulse to take into account the weak is a good and faithful Christian impulse. But it's the sort of thing that needs to be tethered to, well, is it good and true for them and for the community? Because otherwise, it simply becomes a steering wheel. Um, I think that's kind of what's lost is in Chesterton has a saying in one of his books that the old Christian virtues have gone mad because they've been isolated from one another, and
Hmm.
so you get this kind of what I call elsewhere that untethered empathy, where compassion and desire to care for someone who's hurting or care for someone who's having a hard time, um, that gets untethered from what's good and true, and therefore you're just at the mercy of wherever
Right.
their passions want to go. So I think that at one level, there's a kind of oftentimes though underneath that is just a discomfort with emotional intensity. Like
Hmm.
we don't like it when other people are agitated. Their agitation makes us agitated, and then I think we rationalize it in the name of compassion. Well, the loving and compassionate thing to do would be to you
Right.
accommodate, and so we're really good at letting our passions submit to the passions of others, and then rationalizing it and justifying it after the fact on Christian principles. I think that's kind of
Wow.
what's going on. It's that untethering from any view of like, well, what's good in the long run? Is it better to sort of and I think parents know this about their kids. They just often, although it's showing up, I think in our parenting practices as well, that if you if your kid throws a temper tantrum and you're always giving in, you're teaching them the way the world works, and
Right.
the world works by temper tantrums get your way. And we have a generation, we have a civilization that has operated that way to the point where you need safe spaces in colleges and in workplaces because we've coddled it so long that people don't know how to deal. And so because of that, they're highly sensitive. It's not normal sensitivity. They've
Right.
been conditioned, and therefore, when a leader comes along and says, "No, that's not what we're going to do," I'm not worried first and foremost about your feelings. I'm worried about your good, what's good for you. Um, it's received as harsh and insensitive and heartless and cruel, and all these words get thrown out.
Right.
And a leader who's really susceptible to his reputation will often buckle precisely at that moment.
Wow. That's good. You do say, as a result, the individuals and institutions that ought to act as shock absorbers in crisis are instead held hostage and paralyzed by indecision and failures of nerve. I've seen this I've seen this so much. Like it's that's an incredible truism, that line there. I'm curious. So the Friedman book is a failure of nerve. Talk to us
Correct.
about what a failure of nerve is.
Yeah. So oftentimes there's kind of two ways that any kind of leader, if maybe think of it this way, fundamental to leadership is the idea of oversight. And so oversight is basically sight plus responsibility. So if oversight's not just sight, some people can just be observers, but they're not responsible to do anything. And so if you're a leader, though, you're supposed to exercise oversight over your family or your church or your business or whatever it is, um, which means there's sort of two ways that you could fail if you have those two obligations, sight plus responsibility. Then you could fail to see, or you could fail to act.
Hmm.
And so sometimes there's a failure to see. You didn't see what was going on, you weren't aware of it, and that can be a failure of discernment. Maybe you don't recognize what's going on, what time it is, who's doing what. Um, but frequently we actually do see it. And the second failure is that failure of nerve, where you see what's going on, you see where the problem is, who the problem is, what the dynamics are, but it would cost you something, it would be painful,
Right.
and it's easier to kind of limp along in sort of chronic dysfunction than it is to actually have the surgery and take a stand. That require and at the risk of displeasing. So if I take this stand, there's going to be a lot of folks who are unhappy, and not just often. What I find is it's not just the most reactive person. That they're actually um, that's there, but it's actually a lot of the other just kind of nice people that are actually that are the reasonable ones who will say things to you like, yeah, we know she overreacted. Yeah, we know he shouldn't have said what he said. He shouldn't have popped off like that. Yeah, we get it. But don't you think that you also contributed to this in some way? Don't you
Right.
think that
Right.
you if you hadn't said that, they wouldn't have reacted that way. So
Right.
maybe if they apologize for reacting that way, maybe you could apologize for setting them off. And it's like, well, is it a sin to say it? Was it a sin to say that true thing that I said? Well, no, it wasn't wrong. It was true. I get it, but maybe you said it too, and then this is where you said it too harshly, or you said it in the wrong tone of voice, or you didn't say it exactly the right way, which is again catering to the sensitivities. And it's that pressure actually from the nice people, from the reasonable ones who are willing to grant problems on both sides. That's actually the most difficult for a leader to resist,
Hmm.
um, because it's couched in such winsome terms.
Right. You talk about and Friedman talks about this too. The solution to this society wide sickness is well differentiated leadership, and he goes on to say a well differentiated leader is someone who has clarity about his or her own life goals, and therefore someone who's less likely to become lost in the anxious emotional processes swirling about. Um, and that's a pretty incredible statement. He says, I mean, someone who can be separate while still remaining connected, and therefore can maintain a modifying, non-anxious, and sometimes challenging presence. How? So you're just talking about like that difficult situation. How does the well differentiated leader, or this kind of leader, how should they react in that kind
Yeah.
of circumstance?
Yeah, so this is another place where Friedman's terms are helpful. They're often psychological, kind of therapeutic. Well differentiated leader with a non anxious presence doesn't roll. It says a lot, but it doesn't roll off the tongue. I think the biblical term for this virtue is sober mindedness.
Hmm.
And so it's sober mindedness that is the kind of biblical term for what it is. And interestingly, if you look in the lists of like pastoral qualifications, sober mindedness is everywhere mentioned as one of the core ones. You must be sober minded. And the
Right.
idea with sober mindedness is that I kind of summarize it as there's a clarity of mind. So that's he's not fogged by his passions or the passions of others. He's not at the mercy of of anxiety storms and social stampedes. But there's a clarity of vision, and then there's a stability of soul, which for me really ties in. This is where the I think the biblical element comes into play. It's fear of the Lord that gives you that kind of gravity, that gives you that kind
Hmm.
of sturdiness and steadfastness. That when the storms come, the storms of the passions and the swirling anxiety storms come, you're not tossed because you have some ballast in your boat. You're not tethered to just the waves, but you're actually have something substantive that's anchoring you. And
Hmm.
so that clarity of mind, that stability of soul, and then their readiness to act. Um, and I think that's a big piece there. Is it's where you're ready to act, you're not reacting. So the difference between acting and reacting has to do with whether or not it's done with intentionality and with a long-term good in view, or whether it's simply a quick fix, impulsive, sort of snap reaction. Um, and so that when leaders are operating in terms of that snap reaction, impulsivity, that's the problem. That's the passions at play, as opposed to someone goes, all right, I see the problem. I'm sturdy. I'm not caught up in it. And now I can sort of use wisdom to go, what's the good thing to do here? What's the faithful thing to do here? What does God want me to do here? Not just what do the people want me to do here? And that's where some of the biblical examples really come into play of times when leaders, think of Paul confronting Peter in Galatians at Antioch, where, hey, this is going to be a big stinker. If he walks into this big church meeting and is like, Peter of all people, like the lead apostle, you're condemned by your actions. There's going to be a lot of people who are getting happy with this. But Paul's like, but he's tethered to something. He's like, I'm not trying to please man. I'm trying to please God. And Peter's not pleasing God. And so I'm gonna lean in, and I'm not gonna be reactive. I'm not gonna just be throwing punches, lobbing grenades left and right. But I am gonna press in with that sober-minded clarity to try to draw out the fear and hypocrisy that are sort of swirling under the surface.
So emotional sabotage, does that originate mainly from without? Does it originate mainly from within? Is it a mixture of both? Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
the language of sabotage is interesting because basically what it is sabotage is when you have a plan and then something happens to take you off that plan. So hijacking would be another one. Steering is one that I use a lot now. So to be steered, to be hijacked, to be sabotaged, where you're kneecapped, where the thing that you're trying to do is you're not being allowed to do it. And it's actually there's an objective dimension where it is external, like somebody or somebody's group is doing the sabotaging. But the real question is not what they're going to do. If you're a leader, you have to budget for sabotage. Like that's just baked into the cake.
Yeah.
The real question is about you and about how you respond when it comes. And that's where the leaders, the sensitivity a leader needs to have is when his passions get going. So other people's may get going, but does that cause yours to churn? Do you start to get a little jittery? Do you shut down? Maybe some people shut down when emotions get high; they just close off. Where's your own self-awareness and self-knowledge to know how are you responding to what's outside of you? That's the first thing that a leader has to get a grip on by the grace of God, is to get a grip on himself and go, okay, here's the sabotage we knew was coming. Now, how do I want to respond, not react? How do I respond to it?
I like that. So the subtitle, I want to walk through each of those bits because you talk about resisting the anxiety, the angst that'll wreck your family. Where do you see this emotional sabotage coming in and wrecking the family?
Yeah, so I think, an obvious place is, you know, uh, husbands who subscribe to the philosophy of if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy, right?
Mm,
Like that view of a household where basically, and it could be, and sometimes it's mama, sometimes it's kids,
right.
but basically here's a member of this household who whatever they want they get, and their happiness is their immediate happiness, their momentary happiness in any given moment is the thing that drives the ship. And it's difficult, right? Because oftentimes that if mom ain't happy philosophy is masked by be a servant leader, which which
Right.
which sounds good and sounds biblical, but what it actually means is do whatever she says, which isn't leadership. It's abdication, but it feels holy. It feels like the sort of thing Jesus might have done. But
Mm,
Jesus didn't do that. Jesus didn't just say, well, whatever the sinners want to do, we'll just do that. No, Jesus actually led. What's good for them? What's needful for them? That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do the hard thing.
mm,
So I think that's one place in the home where husbands will sometimes abdicate and refuse to take responsibility, um, and therefore avoid hard conversations, acquiesce when they think, yes, this isn't a good idea, but I'm going to do it anyway just to keep the peace. Um, those are the sort of temptations, and that can happen with a wife, but also going to happen with the kids, where they're just kind of avoiding the conflict, as opposed to what does God want? Let's lead there and call the family to follow me as the head of this home.
Hmm. You mentioned resisting the anxiety that'll destroy your church.
Yeah.
Um, so talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so in this is where that Galatians passage really is interesting because it illustrates the way that passions and anxiety kind of course like come. So in the story in Galatians, Peter's eating with the Gentiles until certain men come from James with a message,
Right.
and Peter withdraws. It says fearing the circumcision party, and so you begin to see like okay, there's the circumcision party. I think that's unbelieving. It's unbelieving Jews, but it's also maybe the kind of Pharisaical Judaizer types. So they're out there, and you can imagine that they've been persecuting the church in Jerusalem, and that they've heard that Peter's eating with Gentiles, and that's causing greater persecution. And so James, thinking about his people compassionately, says, "Hey, let's send a note to Peter saying, hey, Peter, could you just chill for a minute? Like this is hard." And so you can see how that worldly passion gets channeled through James and his messengers to Peter. And then Peter, it says, he withdraws. And then the rest of the Jews join him in his hypocrisy, even Barnabas. And so there you just kind of see that chain reaction. And I think that there's ways that we kind of, that churches have that where, whether it's something out in the world or just a member of the congregation is kind of the initial, and then it kind of amplifies as it works its way through the system until it gets close to you, where now it's not, it's actually still really reactive, but it's now masked by, again, that reasonableness. That's kind of how it'll show up in a church setting.
Wow.
Okay, hold on
So
just a second.
no, that's all right.
Thanks, buddy.
So yeah, we're talking about the anxiety that'll wreck your family and destroy your church. And if you're listening, if you're watching, and you've been in a church setting, you're probably well aware of what Dr. Rigney's talking about.
Hey,
So you want to join the interview?
yeah, he does. He
Yeah,
says he sees daddy on the screen.
he's
He must have.
welcome. He's welcome to join the interview. Um, yeah, as someone who's been like in a variety of church settings, I've seen this time and time and time and time again. And often I didn't have the precise language that you're using, sober minded. That's really, I appreciate the gift of that language. I've said stuff like, a leader without a backbone, or, a leader without a spine. I love putting the biblical language of sober minded to that. I think it's really, really helpful. But, I'm where I live right now, like in my current context. I've seen several congregations, and one in particular where that has been the case. It's been uh, a, a non sober minded person, right? And it's just completely wrecked and devastated the community, and the trickle down effect has been an absolute nightmare. And it's not only, had damaging effects on that community, but the wider community as well. And here's something else, like, I'm going through this situation right now within my denomination. The LGBT stuff is everywhere. And I'm a voice speaking out against that. And you have people who are trying to introduce that and implement that, and push that through the door. And what's happening is I'm getting called. Yeah, I'm really getting gaslighted, essentially. Yeah, like they're making me seem like the normal stance that I'm taking is like radical or crazy. And I'm looking at that and thinking, you're caught up in your emotions. You lack a backbone. I'm being sober minded as far as I can tell, and I'm speaking the truth. And if that hurts you, then you need to take that up with your maker, right? Like, but you just see the the swirl of damage this does to so many people. A lack of sober mindedness, lack of backbone. Yeah, I mean, it's really sad.
Yeah, no, it is, and you see again that's that language. I think I probably picked this up from Friedman. That language of shock absorber,
Yeah.
where leaders ought to be able. They here comes the anxiety lightning, boom, and it hits you, and it's like it just dissipates. As opposed to a leader who receives it and then kind of funnels it back into the system, but even more so, because
Mm,
so he's actually amping up that electrical strike of the passions, rather than dissipating it, because he's like, oh, that's fine, I'm because he's anchored someplace else. He's so there is a, if I knew my electrical mechanisms better, I could probably get you. There'd be a really good analogy there for, like, making sure that you're grounded or not grounded, or whichever
right.
one it is. But it does, if you're sending it back into the system,
Mm,
then it gets more destructive, and it's just going to continue. The dominoes will keep falling, if the leader falls. That's what was going on in Antioch. That's what makes Paul kind of this remarkable figure, because everywhere he goes, there's riots, and it's not because he's ever out of control. And so the optical illusion is that Paul, everywhere Paul
right.
goes, he's causing these problems. When what it is no, he's revealing problems. His
Yes.
presence, his sober-minded presence, drives his enemies absolutely crazy, and they're going to slander, and they're going to stir up mobs. They're going to make up stuff, and they're going to try to kill him. And if someone said, "Oh, this is what happens in the book of Acts," right? Is oh, here's the guy who turns the world upside down, and Paul's like, well, I'm just a Jew from Tarsus. I'm just an apostle of Jesus. I'm just, that's it. I'm nobody special. But to his enemies, it's this absolutely unthinkable thing where they've got to take him out because he's a threat, to that status quo.
Mm. So how does emotional sabotage and anxiety wreck and ruin the world?
Yeah, I think it is. Well, if you don't have godly households, and if your churches aren't there, then there's nothing to leaven the world. There's no, the salt's lost its savor, and therefore it's just worthless, and so everything's gonna kind of fall apart. So when you do see Paul in the book of Acts, dealing with all kinds of sabotage from the world, but often laundered through the religious leaders of his day. But it's this kind of unholy alliance of, the Romans. It's the Jewish leaders getting the Romans to do their dirty work, and it's just massive confusion. And I think the thing that's so encouraging is that the world's falling apart, and Paul never loses his head. He's always like,
Mm,
this is an opportunity. He knows who's writing the story. He know he knows who's in charge. That God's governing things, and so everything that comes his way is from the hand of God. That's the fundamental thing that he knows, and therefore, oh, this is just another opportunity to give my testimony, or this is another opportunity to talk about Jesus. He just rolls with it, and I find that a really helpful. You can't control the circumstances. That's above your pay
yeah.
grade, but you do control your faithfulness. Like that's what God has in trust. That's what you're responsible for, is your own faithfulness, and if you're a leader, the faithfulness of your institution, your home or your church or your business or whatever. Um, that's what you're responsible for. So be faithful, even if the world's losing it.
I love that. What would you say to the pastor who's in the thick of, you know, congregational or denominational, you know, turmoil?
Yeah. Um, I think a big thing is, the temptation is going to be to avoid conflict, and the better, if there's a big problem, the issue is picking the battle, not avoiding the battle. So it
Hmm.
doesn't mean you have to always fight, but and so having a plan where, okay, I'm going to provoke this. And so becoming comfortable being the one who's going to draw. So oftentimes in a denominational tangle or a church tangle, you will have, what might be called sublimated conflict. It's conflict under the table,
Right.
right? It's in the air, and there's maneuvering, but it's not manifest. And one of the things a good leader should do is to try to get it out on the table. Like you want the conflict to be visible, everybody
Right.
to know it, which means you have to say things that are going to draw it out into the open in order to bring clarity. Do we really want to do this? And then knowing that people are not going to like that you did that.
Yeah.
We see this often in the Old Testament. Elijah is the troubler of Israel when it's, Ahab calls him, "You're the troubler of Israel." And it's like Ahab's the one who's leading the people into idolatry and all kinds of manifest wickedness. He's the actual one causing the trouble.
Yeah.
Elijah is just the one who won't let him get away with it and is going to keep and won't be quiet. He's the prophet that won't shut up,
Yeah.
who won't go along with it. And so there's a similar thing, I think, for leaders in denominations that are compromised, where being willing to go, I'm going to be the guy again.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go ahead and say it again. I'm gonna say, hey, are we really going to do this, everybody? And the key there is to do it in that sober-minded way, where you know that there's going to be eruptions, but you're not going to erupt. You're budgeting for it. You know that there's going to be slander. You know that there's going to be lies, and you're like, I'm ready for that. I'm just going to keep patiently, persistently pressing in to these issues in order to bring them to light, and then trusting God with the results. So they may stone you, they may kick you out, they may, this success isn't promised, but they also might repent, and you might get reformation. So the results are in God's hands, but the faithfulness is up to you.
I love that. Friends, if you're watching or if you're listening, go grab a copy. This is Canon Press. It's published this. And it's not a long book. It's just short of 80 pages. So it's a good book. You could probably read it in a day, in a few hours if you sat down. But you're probably going to be like me and you're going to read pages over and over and over. And just, you're going to want to chew on it and digest it. There's so much good stuff in this book. So much good stuff. And I highly encourage everybody to check it out. Leadership and Emotional Sabotage, Resisting the Anxiety That'll Wreck Your Family, Destroy Your Church, and Ruin the World by Dr. Joe Rigney. And in the link, in the description of the podcast here, I'll have a link to that. But Dr. Rigney, man, thanks so much for coming on to talk about this. I hope our listeners get a copy.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. Thanks for
Yeah.
reading it.
Yeah. Are there other places that our viewers or listeners might be able to keep up with you and what you're doing? Do you have a personal website, social media, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, social media. I'm on Twitter, X, or whatever they call it now. Joe_Rigney. But largely, Canon Plus. Canon Plus is the kind of normal place where I show up, whether it's in books or videos or courses and things like that. So that'd be the place. There's lots of old stuff at Desiring God. I've got a number of other books that you could go track down on C.S. Lewis and Fighting Sexual Sin and Enjoying the Things of Earth. There's a number of other books if those sound interesting, but by and large, that's where you can find me.
Yeah, right on. So go check out that stuff, Joe_Rigney on Twitter. And while you're at it, go check out gloshouse.com. Always good stuff coming out there. And the Proof Text podcast. It's the audio form of this podcast, and Glossa House TV channel on YouTube where you can watch the video version of this. So Joe, it's great meeting you, brother. Blessings to you on your teaching ministry, your church ministry, your publishing ministry, and all those things. Again, thanks for coming on.
My
Yeah.
pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, friends, we're going to wrap up there. We're going to stop there and say we hope that helps.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.